My name is Allison Mckenzie-Ingram, and today I will be presenting a video lesson on the Hardy-Weinberg principle and the evolution of populations. The video has been created for Fundamentals of Evolution 7490 at Georgia State University, and the lesson is appropriate for college prep and advanced placement courses. Godfrey Hardy, a British mathematician, and Wilhelm Weinberg, a German physicist, independently deduce the conditions to determine if a population is evolving. This principle became known as the Hardy-Weinberg equation, and they actually deduced the principle in 1908. I don't want to go into great detail about the Hardy-Weinberg equation for the sake of time. I think that would be more appropriately covered in a future lesson, but I do want to briefly mention a little bit of information about the equation because I think that it will help to shed light on the 5 assumptions, which I will be discussing momentarily. So the Hardy-Weinberg equation is stated as p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. P and Q represent the frequencies of alleles in a population. And keep in mind that we are diploid organisms, so for every gene we possess 2 copies or 2 alleles. P and Q, of course, would be representing the variations of alleles that may be found in a population. P squared, 2pq, and Q squared represent the frequencies of the homozygous dominant, the heterozygous, and the homozygous recessive genotypes, respectively. So there are basically 2 conclusions that can be drawn by the Hardy-Weinberg principle. And those are, number 1, that the allele frequencies, and once again, P and Q are representing the allele frequencies, that those should remain constant from generation to generation. The second conclusion states that if the values of P and Q are known, then those values can be used to calculate the genotype frequencies that are given by p squared, 2pq, and q squared. So if both conclusions are met, then we can assume that the population is in equilibrium or it's non-evolving. So I'd like to cover a little vocab to get us started, because I think that if you have an understanding of the vocabulary, then it should help to clarify with the 5 assumptions that I will be discussing momentarily. Okay, so we've talked about the Hardy-Weinberg equation, and it deals with determining if a population is in equilibrium or if it's in a non-evolving state. So we define evolution as a change in the genetic makeup of a population or a change in the population's gene pool. Okay, you may often see it referred to as change below the species level or a change in the allele frequencies within a population. Okay, we define a population as a group of organisms that can interbreed, and they're typically living in a localized area. Okay, a gene is a unit of heredity, and genes, of course, will carry instructions for producing polypeptides and RNA molecules. The sum total of all the alleles at all the loci in a population is referred to as the population's gene pool. Okay, alternate forms of genes are alleles, and I've mentioned that we are diploid organisms, so we carry 2 alleles for each gene. Okay, the genotype is the combination of alleles, and the locus is the location of a gene. Okay, so once again, to clarify, evolution is of change in a population's gene pool. Okay, population is a group of organisms that can interbreed. Okay, gene is a unit of heredity. The sum total of all the alleles at all the loci in a population is the gene pool. Alleles are alternate forms of genes. The combination of alleles is the genotype, and the location of a gene is the locus. There are 5 conditions that are required for genetic equilibrium. And keep in mind that the Hardy-Weinberg principles only apply to sexually reproducing organisms. The 5 assumptions are no mutation, population size is infinite, Okay, this would tend to minimize the effects of genetic drift. There's no gene flow or migration. Mating is random. And there's no differential selection among genotypes. So once again, the 5 assumptions are no mutation, no genetic drift, no gene flow, random mating, and no natural selection. The first assumption that I would like to discuss is no mutation. Mutation is defined as a change in the nucleotide sequence of an organism's DNA. So mutations tend to be a very slow mechanism for evolutionary change, but they are important. And the reason why they're important is because mutations can alter allele and genotypic frequencies within a population by constantly introducing new genes into the population. Now, these mutations that are introduced may be neutral, they may be detrimental, or they may be beneficial. Most of the time, mutations tend to be neutral or detrimental. Okay, but there are instances when mutations do provide benefits for members of a particular population. So as I mentioned, mutation tends to be a very weak mechanism for evolution, but if we couple mutation with another mechanism like natural selection, then mutations are highly important because they provide the raw material upon which natural selection acts. The second assumption is that population size must be infinite. This is important because larger populations tend to be less affected by genetic drift. Genetic drift is defined as a chance event that causes allele frequencies to fluctuate unpredictably. So there are certain circumstances that can result in genetic drift having a huge impact on a population. 2 examples are the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. The first example of genetic drift that I'd like to discuss is the founder effect. The image that I've shown is of an individual that suffers from a condition called polydactyly. And polydactyly basically results in organisms having an abnormal number of digits. The reason why I've chosen this image is because polydactyly tends to be represented more in the Amish population as compared to the general population, and this is because of the founder effect. So the founder effect basically results when members of a parent population or a small number of individuals within a parent population become isolated from that population. And in becoming isolated, we tend to see that if we're comparing the allele frequencies in the new population to those found in the parent population, there tends to be a disparity. So genetic drift is important as a mechanism for evolution because it alters allele and genotypic frequencies. And we definitely see the effects of genetic drift exhibited in very small populations. So if we were to examine the occurrence of the alleles that cause polydactyly and also dwarfism in the Amish population, then we would see that these alleles tend to be more highly represented. Okay, and this is due, once again, to the founder effect. The second example of genetic drift is the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect results in a population becoming reduced in size due to a natural disaster or human actions. 2 examples of populations that have experienced bottlenecks are the cheetah population and the North American bison. So we talked a little bit about genetic variation, and we know that genetic variation is a key ingredient for evolution. Populations, of course, that experience bottlenecks will undergo a loss of genetic variation. And so we can see how the bottleneck effect tends to serve as a mechanism for evolution because it alters allele and genotypic frequencies. When populations tend to be more genetically uniform, they're more prone to extinction because they might not have members that are adapted to changing environmental conditions. So if we look at the cheetah population, and the cheetah population has been studied quite frequently, we find that there's very little genetic variation within the population. I think that the research shows that members of certain populations are pretty much about 99% similar. They believe that the cheetah population faced a bottleneck about 10,000 years ago during the late Pleistocene. The bison population, on the other hand, experienced a bottleneck during the late 1800s, and it was basically due to overhunting. They were being hunted for their hides, meat, and sport. The next assumption is no gene flow. So gene flow serves as an important mechanism for evolution because it can alter the allelic and genotypic frequencies. And this occurs, of course, when organisms enter a population or organisms exit a population. So an example of this might be organisms that maybe migrate to an island and tend to colonize that island. Okay, we might also see genes being introduced into a population by organisms, and that in turn can increase the genetic variation that's already present. The next assumption is random mating, which is just basically mating without preference. Random mating is required for genetic equilibrium because it prevents inbreeding. Inbreeding is a form of non-random mating that alters genotype frequencies. So we can see how inbreeding can serve as a mechanism for evolution because inbreeding tends to promote homozygosity and it tends to decrease the heterozygosity within a population. And heterozygosity, of course, maintains the genetic variation that we see within a population. The last assumption is no selection. Natural selection was proposed by Charles Darwin in his book on the origin of species in 1859. The last assumption, as I mentioned, is no natural selection. Natural selection serves as a mechanism for evolution because it alters allele and genotypic frequencies. We define natural selection as the differential survival and reproduction of individuals in a population based on variation in their traits. Charles Darwin, as I mentioned, published his book on the origin of species in 1859. And his theory basically states that individuals will show variation. Those variations can be inherited. Organisms will produce more offspring than can survive, and that variations that increase success will be more likely to be passed on to future generations. So there are two well-known studies of evolution or natural selection serving as a force or a mechanism for evolution, and those are the peppered moth studies and the Galapagos finches. So that concludes our video lesson on the Hardy-Weinberg principle. I hope you've enjoyed it.